Welcome everyone. Today we have our another new episode, and this is very important, very interesting because many people from Asia Pacific, they are very much interested about cyber security, and we will discuss this topic, cyber security, with the integration of artificial intelligence. And we have our world famous speaker, Professor Rob, Professor Edward, Mr. Martin from Switzerland, as well as we have our new energetic friend. He joined already World Talent Economy Forum in our core team. So Mr. Jeff. So I want to start from Professor Edward. How do you want to analyze to this topic? Then Professor Rob.
Okay, yeah. What I want to do first is put it into context. Artificial intelligence is everywhere already. I mean, it's in our smartphones, it's in our obviously computers, it's in a lot of logistics now is handled by artificial intelligence. And in the future, it's only going to be more and more artificial intelligence integrated into our economies, into our social institutions, and into our lives. I like to highlight two areas especially. One is manufacturing and logistics, where you're going to see a lot more of that. Rob can perhaps speak to that. The other that I'm very interested in, of course, is healthcare, converting our current sick care system into a healthcare system. And the more we can diagnose people, do their sequence their genome, have monitoring, in real-time monitoring, with each individual hooked up to an artificial intelligence, then the artificial intelligence can monitor our health. And if you're about to have a heart attack, the AI might know it before you know it, and you'll have the medics at the door. And of course, the AI is also going to be working to devise the cures or the treatments. I mean, we already have the CRISPR-Cas9 tool that's promised it to be very successful. So the point is, artificial intelligence literally is going to control our lives for so many aspects. What that means, of course, is that security is going to become an even more important issue. I mean, what we've seen in the United States in just the last month is biohackers, for example, ransoming businesses and communities and government agencies, saying, if you don't pay us this much, we're going to shut you down. We're going to shut your water system down, and so on and so forth. So now imagine the more and more artificial intelligence is integrated into our systems, that danger is multiplied even more. And not just the problem with hackers who just simply basically want to get money out of people, but obviously terrorists and so forth who want to use it for nefarious purposes. They don't want to necessarily get money out of a country or an agency or whatever. They just want to destroy it. There's indications that Russia has been behind some of this. China probably has too, quite frankly. And so security is going to be a top issue. If all of these wonderful things that we talk about in terms of exponential technology are to come to fruition, we really need to look at the security side of the situation. So again, I call on everybody, especially the Asian Pacific markets, which of course are incredible emerging markets, to don't slow down necessarily on what you're doing in terms of integrating exponential technology into sort of every aspect of the economy and the society, but understand that it has to go hand in hand with the security issue for personal reasons, for economic reasons, for pretty much every reason we can imagine. And I'm sure some of my colleagues here can discuss in more detail some of those matters.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Professor Rob, how do you want to analyze? Yes, analyze this topic, but I just want to add some case study from Asia Pacific, from our personal experience, especially country like India, even China, even Malaysia. They are trying to developing this like cyber security, as well as they are trying to integrate this artificial intelligence. And I'm sure they will observe today's show, the companies, those who are trying to develop cyber security. So my question is that what type of features they need to develop? Second things, how they can integrate it in the practical industries, like how they can integrate it more, the big corporations like IBMs and IBM and this kind of organization, because majorly their problem is that communication. They cannot communicate their organizations or their process properly with the developed nations. What is your guideline and advice?
Well, one of the leading developers of AI-based cybersecurity is Deep Instinct out of Israel, not a very large company. They had similar issues in terms of breaking out. They ended up partnering with Hewlett-Packard. Now Hewlett-Packard embeds their technology in most of their corporate-focused personal computers, and allows Hewlett-Packard to argue that they're the most secure PC supplier, at least a corporate PC supplier in the world. And so there was a benefit that was achieved when Deep Instinct came out, worked with HP, and HP was able to give them scale, and now they're able to play at an enterprise level and play globally, which for a relatively small company probably wouldn't be possible otherwise. Other companies that play in this space are Cylance. They were acquired by BlackBerry. Similar approach. And by the way, I should point out why AI in cybersecurity. We've gone through kind of an evolution of threats. Back in the 80s, when I first started in security, the threats are mostly sneaker net, people walking around floppy disks that had viruses on them and spreading them place to place. That was pre-internet. We didn't have the kind of security problems we had on mainframes, or mostly breaches where people got credentials and accessed the mainframes. Because once again, not a whole lot in terms of communication between the systems that could be compromised or were compromised at the time. Typically, you'd bribe somebody in the company to get their credentials, and then you'd go in and get access that way. In fact, some of the biggest breaches I participated in or covered of Hitachi and Fujitsu were done that way. So then we moved into the PC era, and that was SneakerNet. And then we came up with the wonderful idea of having the internet. Let's connect a bunch of this stuff, and then we really started to get malware that was spreading relatively rapidly. For most part, the original defense and problem was that Microsoft didn't take security as part of their responsibility and outsource it, which created a nasty dynamic where the security companies had to disparage Microsoft products in order to sell their own. That broke in the early 2000s when Microsoft decided to enter the security field as well and kill that kind of ugly circle that was existing to both promote cybersecurity products and create the problems. And of course, we had then the emergence of polymorphic viruses. These are viruses that work kind of like the COVID-19 does in terms of variants. They would alter themselves over time and make it very hard for you to catch the viruses with scripts, which is the way we used to do it. So we started building intelligence into the antivirus products so that you could get to a point where the first attacker could be defended. Because the issue really was, for much of the early 2000s, that the first couple companies would get compromised. The security companies would learn from them, release updates, and then the next group of companies were protected. It was kind of like herd mentality. It's a little bit like herd immunity, but it didn't work well. And so the movement to artificial intelligence is the desire to move away from looking at scripts, looking at particular viruses, and looking at behavior. So if suddenly you see, and then you can do a lot of stuff. Even if an executive is compromised, if you suddenly see an executive doing something they've never done before, you can flag and limit automatically and have the executive re-authenticate. And that can stop an awful lot of hacks. And that's live hacks as well as malware. And so the current generation of artificial intelligence-driven antivirus products really look at that. They look at behavior that looks out of line with what something should be doing. So for instance, if a printer suddenly starts making database queries and it's never done that before, it will shut down those queries until somebody can take a look at it. They tend to be very invasive. They tend to, when they're operating properly, operate very quickly. That's the advantage of artificial intelligence. It can operate in milliseconds and stop the breach before it goes in. In this age of malware, it is believed that really the only thing that can defend against some of the more advanced ransomware products are something like an artificial intelligence-driven antivirus product, because these are aggressive. They're built now by companies, many of them in Russia, that build these things at an industrial level. I mean, they're high-quality products, and they sell them to others, and then those others do the harm. Russia tends to treat malware much like we treat guns and weapons here in the United States. As long as it's not used for a crime, it's legal. which is problematic because that's how these things spread. They sell to other companies. The other companies do the attack. And as we just saw here in the U.S., if they're found out or caught, they'll disappear, rename themselves, and reappear underneath a new name and go forward. And so the level of defense continues to lag somewhat the threat, but at least with AI, we're getting there. The next big threat, of course, is quantum computing. It is believed that if we get a quantum-driven attack, the only thing that can defend against it is a quantum-level defense. Both quantum encryption and the ability to know when data has been observed in transit, which is the big promise of quantum security, is that you will know that somebody's looked at something, observed something, and the end result is if it's happened during a process where nobody should be observing it, then you could immediately turn off that process. We're not through that. Fortunately, we're not at that level yet. We're nowhere near capable of defending against a quantum attack. And it does look like the quantum encryption products are advancing ahead of this. But, you know, when you've got governments involved, a lot of the advancement is obfuscated. So you don't really know how advanced the security agencies in other countries, including our own, have gone with regard to quantum technology. So it's kind of scary out there. Our biggest defense, though, right now is this AI-driven antivirus effort where you're looking at behavior and you're stepping away from the code and you're making sure everybody operates within the parameters they have been operating, and you're able to cut off the bad behavior. One caveat: one of the biggest breaches that I was brought in on a couple of years back was a breach of a large pharma company, and the attackers spent a year collecting all the information inside that company very gradually, so it didn't pick up on any of the monitors, traffic or otherwise. And they were and pharma companies are relatively well secured as an industry. And after they got the critical information, they sent out a memo to all the employees saying that the pharmaceutical company had been purchased and that they needed to provide their banking information. So they're going to get laid off so that they could get their final checks in their accounts related to this purchase and shutdown, which of course wasn't happening. No managers were copied on this email. Just the employees did. And by the time a manager was made aware of the attack, I think 90% of the employees had been compromised, and the company was gone. The servers were gone. The contacts were gone. No evidence, no trail was available to even find out who had done it. Only that almost every employee in the company had been breached. Fortunately, a lot of them didn't lose their identities, but if you think of identity theft of costing between $250,000 and $500,000 to correct, that could have been a major problem. And also, for a lot of this stuff, companies don't report it, so we don't really know how bad it is out there. We just know it's a lot worse than being reported. So back to AI, and your original question is probably the best example to take is Deep Instinct. Come up with an innovative product and approach, make sure it's innovative, and then go to one of the companies that might make use of the product. HP, of course, is already engaged with Deep Instinct, but Dell has no such engagement. Lenovo's working with a similar company as well, but Dell has not made that kind of hookup yet. So Dell would be an interesting target. And then if you move to the secondary companies, a lot of them have not made these leaps. Acer, ASUS, those class of companies have not made these connections yet, and there might be an opportunity as well to grow in that direction. Other companies to work with: Microsoft just acquired another cybersecurity company. They continue to acquire to get ahead of this. To my knowledge, they have not deployed an AI-based solution yet, so that they'd be a place to go with regard to licensing, but they'd like to buy the companies they acquire from. So just be aware that would probably be an exit strategy with them. They also tend to prefer domestic companies as opposed to foreign, but they will do both. So that's my advice, at least if I were going to come at this. Just recognize it requires a great deal of expertise, an incredible amount of talent, and a considerable number of very highly skilled people to pull this off. This is not something you want to do from scratch. Otherwise, you just won't have the credibility, even if you have the product, to be able to move it.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, sir. Yeah. Mr. Martin, how do you want to analyze today's topic?
I mean, there are, as Rob already mentioned, there are lots of aspects. I mean, on the one side, it's the artificial intelligence and the server security. But when you see, as an example, it's also from a governmental perspective, also from the legislation. When you see, as an example, for Wikileaks, what happens there when the servers are not secured, the information goes out, and basically, as an example, the U.S. government wants to hide something from the public. Yeah, then so basically they want to have the power to have the authority. They want to be able to hack. As an example, for the iPhone, there was also a case like this, that they want to be able to hack things, but they don't want others to hack things. Like, as an example, when they had the virus for the Iranian atomic reactor, I mean, this was a huge operation. This is not just something that is done on a personal computer and just a small program. This was a huge operation to infuse this kind of virus. But I mean, I agree. It also always depends whether data can be altered or whether data may just be viewed. I think the altering of data, it's much more worrisome, especially as an example for the health industry, but also for investments and so on, than just basically viewing data, like, as an example, password hacking. I mean, this might also be bad, but as long as the data are not too compromised from the entity of the data, then I think the harm is usually a little bit less than when the data get altered in the system.
Thank you. Mr. Manuel.
Sure, thank you for the invitation. So what I would like to add today is that if we see cybersecurity on the perspective of the 20th century, it was more about communication, computer networks, and it was a little bit in robotics, but not so much. But on the perspective of the 21st century, we have data privacy, because we have a huge data that needs that we need to secure and that we need to manage, and because of that we require some advanced algorithm where that we can use, and that can be some AI algorithm, some machine learning, or a statistical some statistical algorithms, or it can also be, we can also use some quantum algorithms for the cybersecurity purpose. And now we have the Internet of Things. Everything is connected, and every day we generate a huge amount of geospatial data interconnected with different satellites. So it's important to secure the communication between the ground station and those satellites. Otherwise, if one of those satellites got hacked, we will lose a lot of data, and many businesses will get affected. For example, the finance industry, the healthcare, many industries, especially e-commerce, they can also get affected. So other than that, it's important to have some policies and regulations in place, especially to look into the ethics and the social responsibility. Who is going to be responsible for the cybersecurity attack? Is it going to be the fault of the company owner or the employee? So we need to discuss that also. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Mr. Jeff, he joined World Talent Economy Forum in our core team. Even the youth community, those who want to work with us, you can join in World Talent Economy Forum, because we are growing with our media as well as with our consulting things. We are growing together. So I request especially the young community like Mr. Jeff, you get excellent environment, you get excellent mentors, as well as world-class environment. So hopefully it will be very interesting. Mr. Jeff, how do you want to share your like analysis based on today's topic, and what the insight from your perspective you want to share, especially when we work on cybersecurity. Even the cybersecurity is the cybercrime is increasing, so how we can protect it.
Sure. I don't know much about it, but I think NFTs and blockchain will be important as far as identity verification, and yeah, and that's all I have to say about it.
Okay, no problem. We have our expert panelist, Professor Rob. Professor Rob, I just want to share few data and information. Hopefully, this data and information will be helpful for today's discussion, as more of our content utilizing in academia as well as in industry. Hopefully, even they can utilize these things. I directly want to go to the present situation right now in 2021. What I am observing that cybercrime is increasing. It's increasing like 700%, according to the data. So what is the reason behind that? Even the COVID-19 situation, most of the company, even the startup, small medium enterprise, traditional organizations, they are also moving to this online activities, and they have to manage their remote teams, and many things happening in this internet era. So what type of strategy they can take to protect themselves when we discussing on the cybersecurity and AI integration?
Well, any cybersecurity strategy begins with user training. So it's well before. I mean, your users are your most available intelligences, even though they're not artificial. And if you can train the users and drill them on a regular basis, you can prevent an awful lot of the exploits we're seeing out there. Most of the exploits are still following traditional paths, phishing paths. Even some of the attacks by governments are still coming in by compromising credentials and then abusing those credentials and moving forward. And so if you can get your users to stop giving up their credentials or stop clicking on links that compromise their machine and loading keyloggers, you can solve an awful lot of the problem that's currently out there. You don't need to move to AI. Now, what AI comes in is it provides a stopgap. So if the user becomes compromised, if a system becomes compromised and the AI steps in, sees the behavior, and then corrects it. One of the most onerous attacks we had here in the States was against a casino in Las Vegas, where somebody came in through the connected pump on their aquarium. They were able to spoof the aquarium, and the aquarium had a connected pump that was monitored. They came in, introduced themselves as that pump, and then started making queries because nobody had limited access. A lot of the other stuff that seems to happen is escalation of privilege. Too many people have privileges that they shouldn't have, and they get compromised, and suddenly the attacker has access to everything. And we've always had the disgruntled employee problem, where an employee decides that they're going to do or sell information or do damage because they've been laid off or they've been harmed. We had a CIO one time encrypt the entire database that his company was on because the CEO had fired him over the phone instead of in person. That's what pissed him off, and he pretty much took down his entire company. That clearly he had privilege and abused it. So that's where AI comes in. Is it can step in and stop something like that because it's unusual behavior. I mean, if the CIO starts encrypting everything in the company, that's certainly something he doesn't do every day. So you should be able to identify and stop that before it goes too far. But the first step in securing any site is assuring the people. And that does mean you need to go through regular training and retraining and testing, so that the gaps, the obvious gaps are closed first. Because and if you can't do that, I'm not sure even an AI solution is going to help you, because eventually somebody's going to do some damage using the privilege that they have and fallen within their responsibilities. Martin brought up Snowden and the Wikileaks exploit, and that was an administrator who had way too much privilege, and then used that privilege to pull off confidential information and then distribute it. The response the response, rather than assuring the administrators, was to take a hard look at every single administrator and reduce their privilege, which was part and parcel to correcting the problem. But part of doing this probably should have also been an improvement in the whistleblower behavior inside the agency, so that Snowden didn't feel he had to go outside the company to report, or the organization to report, what was actually criminal activity. So the whole Snowden case is just fascinating for some of us in the U.S. because he'd reported a crime, but then he was hauled off as the criminal. But it showed a showcase that if you do have policies in place that prevent people from internally reporting criminal activity, particularly in a governmental organization, then you are going to have leaks and you are going to have problems. You need to mitigate that inside. And if you've got criminal activity, you might want to mitigate the criminal activity before you start shooting the people that are reporting it. But unfortunately, that's not the world we live in. Back to artificial intelligence, in this particular case, Martin also made another good point with regard to data access and corruption. That plays a major role in the efficacy of AIs in the company. We're rolling out AIs broadly in many companies, and the way you compromise an AI would be compromise the data going into the AI. Garbage in, garbage out is an old statement that plays well here. If you compromise the data going into an AI, and AIs are making decisions at machine speeds, you can do an awful lot of damage very quickly. And those kinds of exploits we're not really prepared to deal with at this time. So assuring the accuracy of the data coming in, the veracity of the data feeding the AIs is going to be critical to assuring that those AIs won't wipe out your company by making bad decisions based on bad data. It's one of the biggest concerns I think my industry has right now as we move from focused AIs and start spinning up at least general purpose AIs in about a decade. Because once we move that step, if we haven't been able to secure the data that these AIs are making decisions from, we're going to have serious problems.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, sir. Mr. Manuel. Yes, Mr. Manuel, how do you want to add some point, especially on cybersecurity? And beside that, I want some of your thoughts, especially many startup young people, they are also developing cybersecurities, even in Malaysia. So how they can develop their startup, develop new features, and how they can solve different kind of problems in the cybersecurity area. What is your advice and guideline?
Sure, thank you. So one of the points I would like to add is, for example, in some companies, in some research institution, in some companies, researchers, they generate a lot of data every day. And sometimes there are some private companies, they reach out to us and they ask for those data, like for collaboration, and they can use the data and implement it with some advanced AI algorithm to generate results. That will be like a collaborative project. But the problem with those projects is that first of all, we don't know if it is secured. And other than that, we don't know if we can trust the other partner, because they can use the data for this project, but after that they can also use the data for their own advantages, and they can get money from it. So I would say that one of the solutions to that is, it would be great if every institutions, they can have their own data scientists, they can have their own cybersecurity analyst or specialist, so that they can conduct their own project internally. For collaboration, they can see that, but it's important maybe to sign some agreement between the partner before going for that, because it's important based on the data that you are exchanging. Other than that, for the new startups that are coming in the field of cybersecurity, data science, I would say that it's important to study the market, to know what is needed in the country, and what people are looking for, what kind of companies are available, and it's important to have a legal system, like to have a policy analyst, to have a legal officer, because that will ensure that will ensure that you are taking your work seriously, and so that big companies and other organizations, they can come to you for collaboration. So it's important to have regulations and policies in place. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Jeff.
Yeah, I was in terms of AI and cyber security, even going into biosecurity. There's this guy, I don't know if you guys know about him, Wim Hof. He does the ice baths, and he can regulate his body temperature, immune system, all these things. And I'm just thinking about, there's also a language model AI on TikTok, the app, so it can learn and grow by itself. So in terms of epigenetics and like coronavirus, auto like so you can, if you can train your body to be have immunity against viruses, then you can train a language model AI applying epigenetics to cybersecurity, for it to, I guess, recognize defenses and stuff like that. So I was thinking about.
Thank you. Professor Rob, as you are highly experienced, you have experience to work in IBM, Microsoft, HP, and all of the big corporations.
Yeah.
So even you engage with them long time, so you know how they grow and how they build up their business. What is your advice? Especially we do discuss on the cyber security. We have many cyber security startup in our ecosystem, even different kind of startup they are working. So what is your advice when they grow their company as a startup? When like what the strategy they can implement to grow their business, and most important thing, what is the difference I always find, because I also get chance to involve with Europe and North America and Asia Pacific, organizational culture, organizational structures. That's why the big corporation like Microsoft, IBM, they are growing around the world. But in Asia Pacific, even though in Asia many corporations, I believe, it's my personal experience, I'm just sharing my honest opinion, they have to grow corporate culture. So what does it mean? How do you want to share your experience with new startup from cybersecurity and AI in Asia Pacific?
Well, so the question doesn't have a lot to do with cybersecurity in this case. You're just talking about how do you grow a corporate technology company. The examples that you probably pull from of successful firms that went from startup to critical mass relatively quickly would be Microsoft and Google. Both companies brought in professional management early on to run the company as the company executives, who were substantially younger, came up to speed, and then eventually the founders of the company took over and began running the company. But their first step was to bring in a CEO that was knowledgeable. It could be a CEO or chairman of the board, but typically CEO that is knowledgeable in the industry and knows how to build a company because they've done it before. More important, they have the contacts necessary to build the relationships, to build out the channel. You've got to build out with software, you don't have to worry so much about logistics inside other than acquiring employees, but you still have to worry about your value channel, the sales channel. And security software is an unusual sale. It requires an insurance sale. Insurance sales are where you go in and you create the threat in the mind of the buyer before that threat actually exists, and then you use that to drive the revenue purchase. And so that's how the industry moves. A lot of companies, technology companies, are just not set up to do insurance sales. It requires a very different mindset than selling a typical application, because, as I say, you have to create the thread in the mind of the seller. I would argue that some of the best salespeople that exist in the industry sell insurance and sell cybersecurity, because it requires a talent that doesn't necessarily exist in sales in general, and really relatively hard sales skills. So that's how I do it. I'd hire somebody that came out of the security industry that had an executive position, hopefully as somebody that actually had been through startup phases, and have them run the company and make sure they had multinational experience so they knew who the heck to hire to sell both inside and outside the country. One of the big issues with Asian companies in particular is an inability to sell outside of their country of origin. You see that a lot with Chinese companies. They just don't seem to be able to move out of China. There's a lot of stuff. And Japan had much the same problem. And if we went back 150 or 200 years, you'd see U.S. had the problem as well. Examples of how companies fixed that were, say, for example, IBM, who was probably the biggest in the tech industry up through the 80s. And what they would do is they would establish a subsidiary in the target country and then sell in that country as if they were a native firm. And that made a huge difference. In the automotive area, Toyota's expansion into becoming the largest automaker in the world was part and parcel to building design shops and presence in the countries they wanted to expand in. So for instance, when they wanted to come to the US, they built an entity in the US that did designs for the US. If you go back before that happened, most of the cars that Toyota sold were not acceptable to the US buying public. So that's it. You bring in experience at the top, somebody that's done this before, use them to guide you through the process. By the way, one caveat, don't bring in somebody that has sales experience. Not initially. You don't want a CEO that comes in from sales. The examples I have of CEOs that have come in from sales are almost all disastrous. The issue is sales guys don't know the fundamentals of how products are built. They know how to move them, but they don't know how they're built. And they often don't get, because they're held back by the CFO and the CEO, they don't get that you have to balance the money you're spending with the money that you're making. And so they tend to overextend their companies and put them under. An example would be one of the guys I worked with at IBM had a sales at IBM, went to work for a company that was doing restaurant supply, took over as CEO. And that restaurant supply company was very profitable and very successful. When he took it over, they just wanted to expand. He put them out of business in 6 months. He just overextended them. The revenues didn't come in as fast as the expenses did, and he just put them under. So he took a family business that's successful for over a decade and just put it down in 6 months. So really, you want somebody initially with a more of an operational background. Hopefully with some development insight, because the part of what you have to understand is what the customer really wants in a product, as well as how to pitch it. So somebody that comes in either as a master developer that's been a senior VP, or somebody that's been in operations that's been a senior VP can help you get started, because they've kind of done some of this stuff before. More important, they'll know who to hire to fill up the gaps that they don't have, and they'll have the contacts necessary to expand outside of the region and the area the company is currently in. Also, to be able to point out a lot of problems that they have experienced in their career that the new company can thereby avoid.
Excellent. I think after long times, I also getting the solutions. So I request those who are observing our show, please try to learn from this kind of show, because these people, they are highly experienced. They have huge experience from the successful organization, and it's priceless. Their experience is priceless.
Now, I've done 3 startups myself. It is a unique skill set. So finding somebody that has gone through that process. And by the way, also knowing when to get rid of them. Generally, you want to take over from the caretaker CEO as soon as you have the skills. Typically, the founders are going to have much more of the religion about the product than the outside CEO. That caretaker CEO is just to get you into a transition stage, so you can now begin growing the company and moving forward, kind of getting the fundamentals done, so you've got a solid foundation to go forward. That's where that experience is absolutely critical.
Thank you. Even the company, those who are looking for salesperson and looking for CEO, even some of the company, they also discuss with World Talent Economy Forum. This is the solution. This is called world-class solutions. So we need to understand who will be the CEO, those who have product knowledge, those who can understand the market. So this position only do not run behind the salespersons and the salespeople. I think it's more than that. Definitely, that is the reason why IBM so successful, Microsoft so successful. So we have to learn these things. Even the Asia Pacific, the corporations, the startup, everybody, they have to learn these things. So that is the things I think our Professor Rob can help us. Yes.
But it also helps if you start training people to be CEOs early. It's a very different skill set. You have to have an awful lot of breadth to do the job properly and be cross-trained in at least the fundamentals of finance, manufacturing, marketing, and sales. If you need at least a foundational element in each of those things to be a successful CEO, because you've got to know when people are lying to you, you've got to know how to set up metrics, and you've got to know how to choose the employees to do the jobs that you don't do yourself. And if you don't have at least the basics in some of those areas, you don't know what attributes to choose in an employee, let alone what processes work and which ones don't. So it requires a lot of breadth. And also it requires something else that we don't really train people to do is often as you come up in a company, you're focused on your own status, your own rewards, your own accomplishments. But when you become CEO, you have to be focused on the accomplishments of the company and the people that report to you. It's no longer about the stuff that you're doing because you've already reached the CEO spot. Now it's about promoting the people below you and promoting the company, not promoting yourself. Steve Jobs was probably the best example of somebody that kind of got that. He used to do things like he'd go to press events and whatever, and if they wanted to do a segment on him, he made them do a segment on the product instead. The famous interview in Time magazine had him holding the iPod in front of his face as he made the point is he didn't want to make it about him. He wasn't selling Steve Jobs. He was selling iPods. And so that level of focus allowed him to take Apple, which is the time he took it over after he'd left and came back, from a company that was on within 6 months of going under to one of the most valuable companies in the world, because he just had a tight focus on making sure that the products were successful. And he to a certain extent, his own ego aside, though, there are a whole bunch of stories about Steve Jobs would make it so you would never want to work for that guy. But he did a number of things right.
Our youth speakers, I'm coming to you because this is very interesting insight. I think everybody can learn from him, especially Professor Rob. And when he analyzed from inside the industry, this is very, very important. Professor Rob, beside that, like in USA, in Silicon Valley, when like this IBM grow or Microsoft grow or this kind of big CEO like Steve Jobs, he's even my hero for my development. So is there any like organizational process, or like these people are natural talented and they grow this kind of big corporations?
Well, a couple of different examples. The IBM has a program inside that I was part of called Executive Resources, where they identify people that have the potential to be CEOs early on, and then they mentor them through the process so they get the breadth that they need inside the company, and that they have a shot at the top spot. Now, there are thousands of us that were in the program. Only one person makes it. But that assures that the person makes it from the top to the top has the breadth, which is why their process is so industrialized. If you look at Steve Jobs, for instance, his first run at Apple, he was fired for cause. He tried to get the CEO he hired fired, and that CEO had more power than he did. And he learned a very valuable lesson that you don't take on the CEO, even if you're a founder, unless you've got backing. Then he came back though after running another company and was able to pull everything together. So it was a combination of him being fired and recognizing he couldn't be the spoiled child he had been. He had to get serious about the job, and when he came back, he was, and he had the knowledge and the support to turn Apple around. Bill Gates is kind of an interesting case. Now that both Apple and Microsoft had caretaker CEOs early on, professional CEOs that ran their companies. But Bill learned from the companies, also a very incredibly focused guy, and kind of a developer's developer. I mean, and kind of a showcase of how you really should, when the company is maturing, have a CEO that has intimate knowledge with a product set and customer set to be successful. And he was kind of that case. However, you recognize that he almost took Microsoft under as well with antitrust actions when he prematurely went after and drove the effort to go after Netscape. And then eventually he quit. And now we've got Satya Nadella, who's perhaps the perfect CEO for the job. I'm moving over to Intel because you're mentioning Silicon Valley. Intel also has a process where they take people and put them in as aides to the CEO and let the CEO kind of mentor them in the breadth needed to run the company. And then those people are on a path to eventually become CEO. Pat Gelsinger, who's the current Intel CEO, went through that path. He was forced out of the company by his peers that thought maybe they should be CEO and he shouldn't. But then he came back after his experience at Dell Technologies and VMware and is arguably the best CEO Intel has seen in its recent history. With the possible exception being Andy Grove, who also had some interesting problems. So it really comes down to experience, making sure that the person running the company is mature and teaching that maturity early on and teaching the critical breadth so the person has enough understanding of the critical aspects of the company to be able to actually run it. And then finally, recognizing that sociopaths and psychopaths who often make it into CEO roles are killers and you don't company killers and you want to make sure you weed out those behavior types fairly early on, and also make sure that the CEO is supportive, somewhat nurturing, can carry the company forward without creating some of the misogyny and problems that often some of the people that have the egos necessary to be CEOs introduce into the company. Some of the CEO firings I've been involved in have been rather spectacular with regard to affairs in the company and misuse of company resources. We had one CEO that I think he spent something like $2 million on his office alone before they fired him. So you've got to watch for those behaviors and weed them out. One final thing you have to watch for, which is unfortunately very common in education, are people that cheat. People that cheat are problematic in the executive ranks because they'll continue to cheat. Intel's last CEO was one of those folks and almost took Intel down, almost destroyed the company. And so you've got to make sure that you're promoting the people for the work they've done, not because they're really good at blaming others for their mistakes or covering up their mistakes or covering up their shortcomings. You want somebody that's got integrity, honesty, and that is nurturing by nature and carries people forward. I actually argue in many cases that as far as sex goes, women generally make better CEOs than men do because they're naturally nurturing, though we tend to weed them out or do ugly things in terms of retraining them. And so a lot of women CEOs become poor emulations of male CEOs as a result, and that becomes problematic because they're not good at being something else. So the goal to actually bring people up that will carry the company forward, nurture it, take care of the employees, and not self-serve themselves is a critical distinction to make as you're building a firm.
Mm-hmm. Excellent, Professor Rob. Mr. Manuel, what do you want to add?
Okay. First of all, I would like to thank Professor Rob for the points that he mentioned. They are really great points.
Excellent point. I'm sure.
Yes.
Please, yes.
Yes, sure. So what I would like to add is it's also important for young people who would like to start a startup. It's important to have a board of advisors, because in the board of advisors you can have many experienced people who they have much more knowledge in the field or doing business, so that they can guide you. And one more thing is, you don't need to be founder and CEO right away, because I think the younger generation, we like to be founder and CEO. You can be founder without being CEO. Like, you can give that CEO for someone else who is much more experienced, and then maybe after a few years, 5 years, 6 years, you can come back and take the place of the CEO. It's also important to train yourself with executive programs, with business coaching programs, to get the skills that are needed to be an entrepreneur. And you also need a strategy analyst and some partnership experts to guide you into building the partnership, global collaboration around your business, and to define a roadmap that your business is going to follow. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Manuel. And another important thing, and we're going to share today's session heavily in the corporate arena, because how Professor Rob actually sharing his experience from Silicon Valley. This is very, very important for the Asia Pacific, for the Asian corporation, even lifelong learning, what Manuel said, that lifelong learning attitude. This is very important. Most of the cases, uh, I find that many of the entrepreneurs, CEO, they do not want to even learn in a one place. And even the COVID-19 situation, many corporations decline. Even they are not ready for like learnings or taking a board of advisor like Professor Rob. And I'm sure if you add Professor Rob and this kind of people in your company, you can save. And yes, I know that Asian corporation, they have their own capacity, they have their own market, but definitely if they want to go like IBM, like HP, like Microsoft, definitely you have to learn, and you have to learn from the right people. So Professor Rob also in our board of advisor, and I'm sure he is very, very valuable for World Talent Economy Forum and for the global community. So we can learn from him as well. And for today's session, definitely we will share as much as possible in between our corporate community. Those who love to learn, those who love to join in our forum, they can join and they can learn directly from Professor Rob, and even they can invite him in the board for their corporate developments. Mr. Jeff, you want to add any point?
No, just as starting up my own company, I find this all very helpful. So thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Martin, how do you want to share your experience from Switzerland? Yes, Switzerland has their own cultural point of view when they develop the startup. Even your company actually supporting many startup and small medium enterprise. So how do you want to share your experience with us?
Yeah, I mean, what we have on our platform is also a directory of service providers, among others, also for the investment industry, also for the security purpose. So I think, and what's also important is we also have on our platform Smart Money Match. Everyone can actually list themselves for free. So basically that people can find the right people. They can also share mutually due diligence, because I think that that's always a very important part, because to know who really has the expertise, because that's often also not very easy in the cybersecurity field, because it's a very complex topic, and young people need to have the right expertise, the right training, and also the right motivation, obviously. But all these points are very crucial, I think. And so with Smart Money Match, we help people also to connect in this area.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir. I directly want to go for the concluding remarks. And before I go to the concluding remarks, I request all of our audience. I know many of the audience from different countries, they share our content in social media. Please share as much as possible. And most important thing is that learn from the right people. So from World Talent Economy Forums, like Professor Rob and many of the world famous speakers, they regularly join in World Talent Economy Forum, and their experience is priceless. Trust me, how they analyze the whole thing. Every moment I am also personally learning. Every moment I learn from Professor Robs and all of the speakers, and I even I'm sure the global communities and the Asia Pacific community, they can learn and they can develop their company. Even the same problem we are facing with one of the cybersecurity company when they selecting we are selecting a CEO. I'm sure if the company follow Professor Rob's strategy, they can figure out how to select a CEO for their company. This is the major problem in Asia Pacific, even in South Asia. When they step by step grow, like most of the company, they just run behind the salespeople. But understanding about the product, understanding about the sales, marketing, finance also important, and definitely lifelong learning is important. This is the very, very important outcome from today's session. And thank you for Professor Rob for sharing this kind of experience. Hopefully you can enlighten us more to joining in World Talent Economy Forum. So I directly want to go for the concluding remarks. First, Mr. Jeffs, then Manuel, then Martin, and finally, Professor Rob with your valuable analysis. Mr. Jeff.
Yeah, I think it's all very important topics we are discussing. Cybersecurity, artificial intelligence, blockchain, cryptocurrency, yeah, and how that relates to our daily lives.
Thank you. Thank you. Mr. Manuel.
Sure. Thank you for the invitation. As concluding remarks, I would like to also remind that it's important for growing startups to always look into the intellectual property parts, because it's important for technology transfer to not share all your projects with anyone who is approaching you for collaboration. It's always important to look into the copyrights and the patents parts. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Manuel, for the valuable points. Mr. Martin.
Yeah, I think what we discussed, everything is very important, but what's also important besides artificial intelligence is also common sense. To really use common sense in daily tasks and see what are the risks. Yeah, because what Rob earlier mentioned, not everything is just artificial intelligence and algorithmically adjusted. That to recognize the risks, you also have to use common sense to look at the different risks. Yeah, and then sometimes you also have to assess point by point the things that can be optimized, should be optimized, but other things also have to be good protocols, basically.
Thank you. Professor Rob.
Sure. Manuel made a good point about advisory councils just a while back, and since I said on a lot of them, it is an important aspect of the company. Though for younger firms, I often think it might be better just to make sure the board of directors is properly staffed, because if it's done properly, then the board of directors in the early years becomes kind of your advisory council, and their votes count. As I mentioned, I've been on a lot of advisory councils. The best ones are ones where, and IBM was probably the best example of this, or where the executive actually listens and acts on the advice. For a lot of the advisory councils, as time goes on, they have a tendency to become rubber stamp entities where we're presented with questions or we're presented with problems where the answer's already been determined and the decision's already been made. And that means we're just sitting there saying, whatever you did was stupid and you shouldn't have done it, which doesn't give you a lot of longevity on an advisory council. So being able to have that kind of capability in the board early on so that the board members are protected and can provide the advice and will be listened to is going to be critical, because there's nothing worse than having an advisory council that tells you to do something, you don't do it, and they spend the next year telling you that you should have done it and they were right, you were wrong. But probably a good way to end an advisory council as well, because not a lot of executives appreciate that. I remember going to a meeting a few years back where the CEO got in front of us and told us we were all idiots for telling him to do one thing and he'd done something else and been successful with it. Not what I'd want to sit through ever again, particularly because it wasn't really true. But at the end of the day, if you can get the proper backing and support, whether at a board level or an advisory council level, you'll avoid an awful lot of mistakes you'll otherwise make, because you'll have access to the experience of that panel. And those folks have undoubtedly made a lot of these mistakes themselves and know how to avoid them now. And that's what the point of an advisory council is, really get an outside view and make sure that you're not just listening to what it is you want to do, and you're getting information that allows you to make better decisions. In terms of CEO training and selection, that is, as you pointed out, a huge problem. We just don't train people well for this particular job. Closest we've had was MBAs. I've got one of those as well, but it really doesn't. It gives you the breadth in some cases that you might need, but it doesn't really tell you, the course of instruction doesn't really tell you how to apply it. That often is gathered simply by working for companies and understanding how the different groups work together and really understanding corporate dynamics. And you don't get corporate dynamics from school, unfortunately, not unless you're doing it through an intern program. And I continue to recommend that anybody in school now should be in an intern program so you can better come out the back end with the job. Both Microsoft and Cisco have aggressive programs, Cisco with a networking academy and Microsoft with its different school events to try to get people trained up and spun up so that when they come out of school, they have jobs ready for them and they're already trained to do them. One of the worst experiences that I had was coming out of college, actually out of graduate school, and then going into a job, and it was 3 months before somebody actually bothered to tell me what my job was. That's 3 months of thinking I was going to get fired every day because I clearly had no clue what I was doing and nobody had any time to tell me what I was supposed to do or even what my responsibilities were. I wouldn't wish that experience on anybody. So the more that you can learn about the nature of work outside of school, the more able you're going to be to do that. And then one final comment, especially back on topic with regard to artificial intelligence and cybersecurity, is there 2 degrees of artificial intelligence: machine learning and direct learning. The machine learning approach is where you're really using a lot of data scientists to develop the underlying product, and they pretty much stay engaged throughout the process. When you go to direct learning, the machine is teaching itself, and it can spin up much more quickly. But here, the data sets become far more important because if the DL AI becomes compromised, it's going to make mistakes at an incredible pace that humans can't counter. So suddenly your cybersecurity product could become malware if you're not careful. So you've got to make sure that the training sets are not being compromised or corrupted. That's absolutely critical. So at the end of the day, we're moving to a period of time where we're going to have AIs against AIs, kind of cyber warfare, computer against computer. That's troubling, and really the only defense is going to be well positioned, well trained, and well supported artificial intelligence and cybersecurity is run by companies that are well run and focused on fixing problems and can't be compromised, blackmailed, or aren't run by people that don't have any care for their customers or employees. Doing this right is critical to the future of our industry.
Thank you, Professor Rob, Mr. Jeff, Mr. Manuel, Mr. Martin, and Edward, those who joined in World Talent Economy Forum discussion. We just finished our 326th episode. 300 people from 100 different corporations and organizations and countries, they join in World Talent Economy Forum. So hopefully our discussions and our collaboration can solve a lot of problem in Asia Pacific. Thank you, Professor Rob, Mr. Manuel, for your continuous support, and Mr. Jeff to join in World Talent Economy Forum core team. Thank you. Bye-bye and take care.
Bye.